Thank you for joining us as we are blessed to hear from our special speaker, Dr. John Goetsch, during our week of revival meetings. Tonight's message, Where is God?
Tonight to the book of Isaiah, chapter 6, if you will. Isaiah chapter 6. Everybody should come to Monroe at least once in their life and taste the cheese, right? That's what you're known for. And thank the Lord for good Wisconsin cheese. They claim in California that we have the best dairy out there. It's a lie. Don't listen to it. It's not true. It's fake news. They show pictures of cows out there, and they say our cows are contented. They've never seen a contented cow in California, believe me. Thankful to be back in my home stomping grounds a bit. I remember when I was a boy, we used to pronounce our name Goetsch. The German pronunciation of my name is Goetsch. The G was a J sound, the OE was an A sound. And so growing up, my name was John Goetsch. And then we met some people from down here in this part of the state whose name was Goetsch. They were Swiss, and so G-O-E-T-Z. And everybody said, well, that's Goetsch, and you're Goetsch. That doesn't make any sense. It has the same first part. So we switched. I don't know who switched, but we switched to Goetsch. And so I tell people now it's just like catch, only Goetsch with a G. So I'm glad to be here, and I guess I owe my name pronunciation to people in Monroe, Wisconsin, or somewhere nearby. But thank you for being here. Isaiah chapter 6, let's look at verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another, and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the doors moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. There'll be times in your life, perhaps even seasons in your life, where you'll wonder, where's God? Does God ever seem like He's missing? Does God ever seem like He's kind of vacated His throne? We kind of wonder if He's even hearing our prayers. We wonder if He's really there, if He really cares. When I was a junior in college, I had been dating a young lady. I guess you'd call it. We really weren't that serious about our lives, but we had become good friends, had been talking to each other since my freshman year, and she was a year and a half ahead of me. She was going to be graduating in January of that year, and I still had a year and a half of college to go. And God had directed her to take a line of training for teaching, and God had gifted her obviously in that area, and she had signed a contract to teach in a Christian school down in Indiana. And so when she would graduate there in January, she was going to make her way there. And like I said, I still had a year and a half of college, and we talked about this quite a bit because God was calling me toward evangelism, and He was using her now to be a teacher, and we really didn't see how that was going to work. I mean, it just seemed like God was taking us 2 different directions. And we talked about this quite a bit. And finally, one day after lunch, we were talking again about it, and we decided that this could not possibly be God's will for us to continue our relationship. She was going to be going off and teaching, and I was preparing to be an evangelist, and it just didn't seem like that could possibly be what God had for us. And so we decided that day that we were going to end our relationship. And I remember going to an afternoon class. I had an upper-level speech class that afternoon, and it was a class that I enjoyed, and a lot of the kids in there, we had taken all these classes together. We always had a lot of fun in there. But that day, man, I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to see anybody. I just chose a seat over by the window by myself because I couldn't stop crying. Now, I'm not a crier, but that day I couldn't stop crying. All of a sudden, there was this hole in my life. There was this vacuum. There was this void that had been left. And I remember sitting there thinking in that class, God, where are you? I need you to minister to me. I need you to help me. I'm falling to pieces here. God, where are you? It was 1975. I had scheduled 3 revival meetings in the city of Los Angeles. I'd never been to California, much less Los Angeles. And so I got in my car. I had a Volkswagen Beetle in those days, and there were no interstate highways. Got on this 2-lane road and started driving to California. And I thought they lied to me in geography class. There is no Pacific Ocean. I thought I was never going to get to California. And finally, I got to the border of California. No air conditioning in my car in those days, and boy, I was ready to get where I was going. And got to Los Angeles. We didn't have GPS in those days. We had maps. For you younger folks, that's a piece of paper with lines on it to tell you where the roads are. And I had a map to Norwalk, California. La Puente, California. That's where my first meeting was. And then to Norwalk, and then to Canoga Park. And I got zeroed in on La Puente, and I found the church. It was about 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And man, I was just glad to be there. Finally arrived after several days of traveling. 55 miles an hour was the speed limit, you know. Just seemed to take forever. Pulled into that parking lot, and as I did, there was a man working on some flower beds around the church. And so I got out of my car, and I went over to him, and I introduced myself, and he introduced himself as the pastor. And after he introduced himself, he said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I'm here to hold a revival meeting." He said, "I don't know anything about that." I said, "Oh, well, have a nice day." I got back in my car. And I am now in the city of Los Angeles for 6 days before the next revival was to start. And I thought, what am I going to do? I don't know anybody. I didn't have a credit card. Nobody had credit cards in 1975. I had $36 in my pocket. And I started driving down that street in front of that church, and I drove probably about 8 or 10 blocks, maybe 12. And I came to an old, what I called a flea bag hotel. In fact, there were 2 or 3 of them to choose from. I pulled in the nicest one, and I went inside, and I asked if I could see the manager. And a man came out. He was very nice, and he said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I'm going to be here for the next 6 days, and I need a room." He said, "No problem." I said, "Well, there's a little bit of a problem." I said, "I only have $36. He kind of thought for a minute, and he reached under the counter, and he pulled out a ring of keys, and he said, "Follow me." We went out a back door, and we went into a kind of a courtyard area. It really wasn't. It was kind of a junk area, but it was between a couple of buildings, and there were a bunch of old beds and dressers back there. And we walked through some weeds across to the other side of that building, and he took one of those keys and unlocked an iron door and pushed it back. And we walked into a room, probably no more than about 10 by 12, something like that. It had a tile floor. There was an iron military cot over on this side with a mattress on it. There was a shower, there was a sink, there was a toilet, and there was a metal folding chair. And he said, "It's all yours, $6 a night." I gave him my $36, and he closed the door. And as he closed that door, I noticed something out of my peripheral, and I looked up above that door, and there was a shelf about like that, and on top of that shelf was a small black and white television set, probably a 13-inch television set. And I remember thinking to myself, well, at least I have a TV. And I remember before I unpacked the thing, I went over to that TV and I clicked it on. And the channel that it was on, it was showing snow. These white lines going across this black background. It just looked like one of those blizzards I'd seen in Wisconsin. And I thought, I don't want to watch snow. I'm here in California, you know. So I turned to the next channel, and it was showing the same program. And I went all the way around those 13 channels, and they were all the same. Static. I remember turning that thing off and sitting on that bed thinking, Lord, where are you? It was about 1983. I was preaching a revival with my family. We were traveling now in a trailer and had 2 children. And we were traveling, and I was preaching a meeting in Warrenville, Illinois, suburb of Chicago, west side of Chicago. The pastor was a church planter, and he had planted churches and stay about 3 years and then move on to the next place. And I'd been with him a couple of times in different locations, and now here he was in Warrenville. And we pulled into his house, a big 3-story house. He had 7 children, and a wonderful man of God, just a very compassionate man, loved to win people to Christ. We parked our trailer there in his driveway, and we began that meeting. And I'll tell you, it was Murphy's Law. If it could go wrong, it went wrong. I mean, everything went wrong in that week. The school we were renting to have the meeting, the janitor would never show up. We had to break in the building even to start the meeting. It just seemed like one thing after another. It just wasn't going well. And I remember about Wednesday, I said to Diane, I said to my wife, I said, you know what? Pastor's really struggling here. I mean, this is not doing well. His kids are discouraged. His wife's discouraged. He's discouraged. And I said, I don't know what the love offering will be this week, but I just sense that God, whatever it is, would have us give it to the pastor. I think he needs it more than we do. And she said, you know, I've been thinking the same thing. I always hated it when my wife agreed with me about things like that, but I said, well, let's pray about it, you know. So Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we prayed about that, and by Friday night, we had decided that's what we were going to do. Well, we had the last service. It was a Friday night, and it went bad. It was just, everything went wrong, and we got back to the house, and he said, come on in. We want to have some popcorn with you with the kids. And so we went inside the house and fellowship for a little bit, and pretty soon he pulled out an envelope, and he said, no, Brother Goetsch, we did our best. I wish it could be more, but we did our best, and we really thank you for coming. And that, for the first time in my life, before or since, I opened that envelope in the sight of the pastor, and I pulled out that check because I was going to sign it and give it to him. And when I pulled it out, I couldn't help but notice the amount. It was for $250. I'm going to tell you, in 1983, that was a lot of money. That was a lot of money for a week of revival meetings. And I had no idea where they would have gotten that kind of money. But I had already decided what I was going to do, so I took my pen, I turned it over, and I signed the back of it, and I said, Pastor, God wants us to give this to you, to your family. Well, he protested, and I said, no, that's what God wants me to do. You're going to take it. He resisted. I put it in his shirt pocket. He started crying. His wife started crying. The kids started crying. I got out of there. I mean, no sense hanging around that, you know. You know, when you obey the Lord like that, you feel good about it. You just feel good. And boy, we went to bed that night in that driveway and slept like a rock. Got up the next morning and hitched up the trailer, and we were headed to St. James, Minnesota. And I had enough fuel on board to get there, I thought. We hooked up that 16,000-pound trailer and pulled out of Chicago and up through Wisconsin, I-94. And we got to La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I looked down, and both of my gas tanks on that truck were on empty. And I still had over 100 miles to go. And I said, Lord, I need gas. And the Lord said, get some. I said, well, that's easy for you to say, but I don't have any money. Gave all my money to the pastor in Chicago. I still didn't have a credit card, and I had no money. The Lord said, get gas. I said, Lord, I can't. I don't have any money. He said, get gas. Now, I had heard some stories about preachers that would pull in a gas station, fill up their tank, and somebody else would pay for it. I didn't have that kind of faith. I was operating on a cash basis, you know. And I said, Lord, I don't have any money. And the Lord reminded me that in the trailer, we had this yellow bucket. It was like a sand bucket that we'd bought for the kids, and the handle had broken, but the kids wanted to keep it and throw their pennies in there. And they would always bug us, you have any pennies? And they'd throw it in that bucket. It was about 3/4 full. We weren't saving it for anything. We were just collecting pennies. And the Lord said, use that. And I pulled into a gas station in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and bought 40 gallons worth of fuel with pennies. I'll never forget the expression on the gas attendant's face as he counted them 2 by 2 on that glass counter. Nor will I forget the expression of the 7 people standing behind me waiting to pay for their gas. But God miraculously got us to St. James. Got to the Manor Baptist Church, little clapboard building on the edge of town, 35 people in the church, the youngest of which was 65 years old. The pastor was working full-time, a job at the lumber yard, 50 hours a week. And we got there and had some prayer Saturday night and kind of got the lay of the land, you know. Sunday morning, went in, did Sunday school and morning service, and afterward, nobody said anything about lunch, so we went out to the trailer and we had a few canned goods we threw together and had some lunch. And I'm thinking, well, they'll feed us a meal tonight, no doubt. But that night, preached, and afterwards the pastor said, well, Brother Goetsch, I got to get up really early to go to work tomorrow, so I'll see you tomorrow night at 7. We went to bed hungry. The next morning, I was washing the trailer down. I always like to wash the trailer and truck down after a long trip, get all that road grime off. And I was washing that trailer, and I was behind that trailer having a pity party. I said, Lord, what gives? Where are you? I mean, I know I did what you told me to do in Chicago. I know I obeyed you. And you miraculously got us here. But what about now? I mean, I'm hungry. And I can fast, that's okay, but I got 2 kids in there. And if I don't feed them, you said in your Bible that if I don't take care of them, I've denied the faith worse than an infidel. Now, where are you? You know what? You're going to have some times like that, aren't you? You're going to have some seasons, maybe a sickness, maybe a death in the family, maybe a financial crisis. There's going to be something in your life where you're going to wonder, where's God? And I think Isaiah is there in our passage. The king has died. That left the land without leadership. It left the land a little bit vulnerable to an enemy attack. And Isaiah, the prophet, he's saying, Lord, we're in a bit of a mess here. We're in a bit of trouble here. We don't have a leader right now. We don't have a king. And the people are wicked. And Lord, where are you? You've got to show yourself here. I think Isaiah is there. And in these verses that we read, these 6 verses, I believe Isaiah, kind of in an underlining way, shows us 3 locations where you can always find God. Now, we know, as I said this morning, God never leaves us or forsakes us. But you know what? We're prone to wander, aren't we? We're prone to leave the God we love. We're prone to walk away. And sometimes when we do that, we wonder, now where's God? And Isaiah shows us 3 locations where we can always go to find God. The first is found in the first few verses. Isaiah gets this glimpse of heaven. He gets this glimpse of the throne of God. And he sees these seraphims, these angelic beings. They have 6 wings. And with twain they're covering their face, with twain they're covering their feet, with twain they did fly. And in verse number 3, one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory. When God seems missing, you'll find Him when you go back to the holy place. God's a holy God. In fact, the word holy is a word that qualifies everything that God is. If you look at the front of your Bible, it probably says Holy Bible on it. Why? Because it's God's book. And the word holy indicates that it's a pure book. It's a true book. It's a book that comes from God. When we talk about God's love, His love is a holy love. When we talk about God's wrath, it's a holy wrath. When we talk about justice from God or fairness, it's a holy fairness. You see, everything that God is qualified by the word holy. God is a holy God. And when you're looking for God, when God seems absent, we've got to get back to the holy place. Exodus 15 and verse 11, Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like unto thee, glorious in holiness? The psalmist said, Worship toward thy holy hill, for the Lord our God is holy. John the Revelator in Revelation chapter 15 and verse 4 says, Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name, for thou only art holy. Now, let me remind you, holy and unholy cannot coexist. So when God seems missing, we've got to look at ourselves and say, wait a minute. Have I allowed unholiness to separate me from God? Have I allowed sin in my life to cause distance here to where I don't sense God's presence? I don't sense God's hearing of my prayers? If we want God's presence, if we want God's power, if we want God's provision and protection, we must stay in the holy place. Leviticus chapter 11 and verse 45, God told the nation of Israel, I am the Lord that brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord thy God, am holy. You know what he told the church at Corinth? Now, the church at Corinth struggled with the flesh. They struggled with the worldly influence in Corinth. They struggled with some real sin issues, even in the church. And Paul wrote there in 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 1, having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves of all filthiness of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the sight of the Lord. We work at perfecting some things in our life. When you were in school, you worked at perfecting some skills. You worked at your handwriting. You worked at your English skills. You worked at your math skills. Mrs. Spoonhauer a moment ago said she practiced her song at home. What was she doing? She was practicing so that she could sing for us and be a blessing. You see, she was perfecting that song. Someone who plays sports, they practice. Why? Because they're trying to perfect their skills. Someone who starts a business, boy, they're reading, they're going to seminars, they're trying to get better at what they're selling or what they're trying to provide to the community. They're perfecting a skill or their market. Now, God says we're to be perfecting holiness. How hard are we working at being holy? We work hard at preaching a sermon, or we work hard at perhaps providing our families with the things they need. We work hard at the things we enjoy, but what about perfecting holiness? The writer of Hebrews said, follow peace and holiness, watch this, without which no man can see the Lord. See, without holiness in our life, without our lives being holy and consecrated to Him, God says, I'm going to be distant. I'm going to be afar off. I'm going to seem like I'm missing. So when the difficulties come, when God seems vacant, go back to the holy place. But I see, secondly, you'll always find God in the humble place. Notice Isaiah's reaction to this scene in front of him in verses 1 to 4. In verse 5, he says, woe is me, for I'm undone. When Isaiah gets a glimpse of God, his immediate response is upon himself and thinking, whoa, I'm undone. When God seems missing, we've got to get back to the humble place. One of my fast becoming favorite verses is Isaiah 66 and verse 2. And in part it says this, to this man will I look. Now, I don't know about you, but I need God to look my way. Right? I mean, I need God's favor. I need God's blessing. I can't be the right kind of husband. I can't be the right kind of dad. I can't be the right kind of grandfather. I can't be the right kind of preacher. I can't do anything without God. For without Him, I can do nothing. So I need God. I need Him to look my way. And it says, to this man will I look, even to him that is of a poor and a contrite spirit, and that trembleth at my word. Humility. The humble place. As I travel, I get to meet a lot of wonderful Christians. But I'll tell you, there's a common thread that runs through people who live for God and serve God, and that's the common thread of humility. You see, God doesn't hang around His abominations. These 6 things that the Lord hates, these 7 are an abomination to Him, a proud look. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination unto the Lord. In Psalm 138 verse 6 it says, though the Lord be high, well, I guess He's about as high as you can go. There's nobody higher than God. He's the creator of the universe. So, though the Lord be high, yet hath He respect unto the lowly. But the proud He knoweth afar off. If I asked you, who do you respect? Well, it would depend upon the context of our conversation, right? If we were talking to a young person, let's say, who was trying to learn to play the piano, And they're practicing, and they're trying to perfect their skills. And I said, well, who do you respect? They would say, well, they would say somebody that plays better than them. They would say their piano teacher, or they would say maybe some famous musician. I said, boy, if I could play like that, that's what I have in my mind as I practice and try to develop. I want to be like them. If we talk to somebody about playing sports, if you talk to a high school basketball player, well, they're trying to perfect their skills like somebody in college or like somebody in the professional ranks. They're looking up to somebody. If you're talking about business, somebody starting up a company, they'd be looking at a company that's already successful. They'd be seeing what they're doing, and they'd try to mimic it. Well, who does God respect? Who does God look up to? He's at the top. The Bible says He has respect unto the lowly. But the proud He knows afar off. You see, if you want God to distance Himself from you, just activate pride in your life. When I was a boy, growing up here in Wisconsin, occasionally I would hear the name Paul Levine. Paul Levine was an evangelist. I'd never heard him preach. I'd never met him, but I heard preachers talk about Paul Levine. And I was sort of interested in it because God was leading me in some of those directions. And I thought, boy, one day I hope I get to meet Paul Levine. Paul Levine grew up in Iowa. He was saved at the age of 4. Don't ever underestimate what happens in those Sunday school classes back there. Paul Levine was called to preach at the age of 4. Now, you might not believe that. But he was called to preach at 4. In fact, his mother said after church on Sunday nights, Paul would come home, and at 4 years old, he would climb up on the piano stool, and he'd get his little Bible, and he'd start preaching. Paul Levine finished high school at the age of 15 and started traveling as a full-time evangelist. Couldn't drive, so had to hitchhike, take public transportation, walk. But he began to preach all over Iowa, southern Minnesota, holding revivals. By the time Paul Levine was 17, he had a singer that traveled with him named Bob Finley. Bob Finley was completely blind. And these two men went all over the Midwest, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and preached revivals. Played their mandolins and sang and preached revivals. And I heard about Paul Levine. In fact, I meet people all the time that tell me they got saved under Paul Levine's ministry. He had a Bible Echoes program on a station in Waterloo, Iowa. Every day, preached the Bible. He had an organization called Bible Tracts Incorporated, which is still in existence today, that printed millions of tracts. In fact, I was in a Flying J truck stop the other day. I went in to use the restroom. I opened the door, and 2 tracts fell on the floor in front of me. One in English, one in Spanish, both printed by Bible Tracts Incorporated. So I'd heard about Paul Levine, but I'd never met him. Thought maybe one day. Well, in 1981, I was holding a revival at the Faith Baptist Church in Danville, Illinois. And one day as I was sitting in the trailer, a knock came on the trailer door, and I opened it, and it was the church secretary. Again, we didn't have cell phones in those days. We had phones that were connected by a string to the wall. And so you had to go to the phone. Okay, so she said, "You have a phone call." Well, I ran into the church. That was pretty common deal. I ran in there and took the call. And the voice on the other end of that line said, "Brother Goetsch, we've never met." But he said, "My name is Bill Rice III, and I'm here at the Bill Rice Ranch in Murfreesboro, Tennessee." And he said, "I would like to see if you could come and preach a youth week in the summer of 1983, 2 years away, for some teenagers here at the ranch. Do you have your calendar?" Man, when he said that, I thought I made the all-star team. I really did. I thought, preach at the ranch. I'd never been to the ranch. I'd never met Bill Rice III. I'd heard him preach. I'd heard his uncle preach, John R. Rice. I'd heard his other uncle preach, Joe B. Rice. I'd heard Bill Rice preach. All the great Rice family, I'd heard them preach. But I'd never met any of them. I'd never been to the ranch, but I'd heard about this place, you know. And they're asking me to preach at the ranch. But that wasn't the big deal. The ranch started in 1953. Bill and Kathy Rice had a deaf daughter. And they wanted to find a place where the gospel could be preached in sign language to deaf people. So they moved to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, bought 1,500 acres of land up in the mountains, and they started the Bill Rice Ranch. And in 1953, of course, they had deaf weeks for those that couldn't hear, but they also started some hearing weeks, and they started a teen week that summer. First one, and they asked Paul Levine to be the preacher. And from 1953 until the mid-1990s, Paul Levine preached every teen week at the Bill Rice Ranch. Some summers, 6-7 weeks, he preached every week. Well, as the ranch got bigger, more and more teens, they asked another preacher to come and share some of that load of preaching. And Dr. Bill was asking me to be that other preacher with Paul Levine. Wow. Man, I couldn't wait for that week to come. Finally it did. We pulled into that ranch, and I remember that first service. I walked into that John R. Rice auditorium from a side door over here. I walked in, there were 1,400 teenagers sitting in that auditorium, ready for the preaching. It was electric. 1,400 teens. I walked in, but I wasn't focused on them. I was thinking, man, I hope I get to meet Paul Levine tonight. And I kind of looked around. I looked up on the platform, and there was nothing up there. It was quite high. There was a piano way down on that end. And that was the only piece of furniture other than the pulpit. And then there was a pew that went all the way across the back. It must have been 30 feet long. And sitting on the far end of that pew was Dr. Paul Levine. I'd seen his picture by this time. I said, that's him. That's him. And he was sitting up there, and he had his Bible open. He had a spiral notebook hanging out of it. And he had his pen out, and he's writing. I thought, he's preparing his message. He's going to preach that. He's preparing. He's getting ready. I thought, man, I hope I get to meet him. About the time I'm taking all this in, a man came up and he said, welcome, Brother Goetsch, to the ranch. My name's Bill Rice III. We still hadn't met. And so we shook hands and greeted each other. I said, thank you for letting me come. And he said, come on up on the platform. I want you to meet Dr. Paul. Oh, wow. I get to meet him now. And so we walked up on the platform, and Dr. Paul Levine stood up, and Dr. Bill said, Brother Paul, this is Dr. Goetsch. And Dr. Levine took my hand in his, both hands, and he said, I'm so glad to meet you. He said, I can't wait to hear you preach. I thought, hear me preach? I'm here to hear you preach. He said, here, sit by me. Sit by me. Oh, wow. And I sat down on that pew next to him. He flipped that notebook out, and he started writing again. I tried to read his sermon. I couldn't read his handwriting. I'm looking at that, couldn't read a thing. Well, we started the service, the singing. Dr. Paul, he just sat there, and he kept scribbling notes. And I was so honored to sit next to him. And finally, it came time to introduce him. And Dr. Bill went up to the pulpit and he said, now, young people, tonight we get to hear Dr. Paul Levine. This man's been preaching for many, many years, since he was 15 years old. He's preached all the youth weeks here at the Bill Rice Ranch for decades now. He said, in fact, Dr. Paul, how many sermons have you preached here at the ranch? Dr. Paul, he's over there still looking at his notebook. But he heard his name and his head kind of popped up and he said, 1,204. And Dr. Bill said, think of that, young people. 1,204 times this man that you're going to hear tonight has preached to teenagers just like you. And he went on to introduce them. And Dr. Paul, he punched me in the ribs. And he cupped his hand and he said, I really don't know how many times I preached. He said, all I know is I ran out of sermons a long time ago. That was Dr. Paul, just as humble as could be. We spent a lot of weeks together in those coming years preaching those youth weeks together. I remember one week, the week wasn't going real well. The teenagers weren't very responsive yet. It was Thursday night. It was time for Dr. Paul to preach, and I could tell he was burdened all through that song service, writing and thinking and praying. During the final special, I kind of just touched him on the knee. I said, Dr. Paul, I'm praying for you. He leaned into me and he said, oh, thanks, Brother Goetsch. I need it. I need it. He said, you know, they always tell me, trust God. Trust God. He said, I do. But I don't trust the devil. And he would say things like that to me that began to shape my life, my ministry. Several years ago now, I was asked to preach a session, just one afternoon session, at what was then called the Holiness Conference up in Menominee Falls, Wisconsin, the Falls Baptist Church. They had many preachers there preaching the services and doing sessions, but I was asked to do an afternoon service. And it was 3 hours long, my session was, from 1 until 4. Can you imagine, right after lunch, trying to keep people's attention for 3 hours? I tried everything I knew to keep those preachers awake, and I did my best. But boy, when I was done, they were out of there. I mean, they had been sitting all afternoon, and they were wanting to go get some dinner and get ready for the great preaching that night. My job was done, so I was packing up my stuff. And everybody was going out the back door. But as I came off that platform, there was one person coming forward. He was feeling his way from pew to pew. You see, he was legally blind now. Cancer riddled his body. His wife was already in heaven. In fact, he would join her in just 2 weeks. But he had that Bible open and that spiral notebook hanging out and a pen in his hand. He came hobbling down that center aisle, and I ran to him. I said, Dr. Paul, Dr. Paul, I didn't know you were here. I never saw him. And you know what he said? He didn't say, hey, Brother Goetsch, how are you? He didn't say that. You know what he said? He pointed that spiral notebook. And he said, I missed letter E under point 5. What was letter E under point 5? I thought, Dr. Paul, you don't need letter E under point 5. You're going to go to heaven in 2 weeks. Just go over and sit down and wait. I mean, you don't need it. I said, Dr. Paul, you don't need it. Big old tears coursing down his face. He said, Brother Goetsch, I need point E under 5. I want to love God more. I want to know this book better. Please. That was Dr. Paul. Humility. When God seems missing, we got to get back to the holy place. We got to get back to the humble place. And then finally, verse 8 shows us we got to get back to the harvest place. Isaiah hears the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And he said, here am I. Send me. You know, when God seems missing, grab some tracts. Grab some of those John Romans. Knock on a few doors. God will meet you there. When God seems absent, call pastors. Say, Pastor, is there anybody in the hospital? Anybody shut in I could go visit, minister to? God's always in the harvest place. Because God's all about the harvest. That's why He came, to seek and to save that which was lost. He's all about the harvest. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God, who will have all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. I love Christmas time, and I love the preaching at Christmas because we just get to review again that wonderful story of His birth. And the Bible, all 4 of the Gospels, have something to add to the birth of Christ and those early days of Joseph and Mary, and then the shepherds and the wise men and Anna and Simeon. And there's just a lot of good preaching there around the birth of Christ, a lot of good things. But then the Bible kind of goes silent, doesn't it, about Jesus? And for years, we go from the time He's about 2 until the time He's 30, and we know almost nothing. Except for one time. You remember it? He was 12. And his mom and dad, earthly mom and dad, Mary and Joseph, they took him up to Jerusalem for a feast. Remember this? And the Bible says they traveled in a company of people, a group of people, probably for safety, maybe for fellowship, maybe accountability. I don't know, but they traveled in a group. And they get up to Jerusalem, they worship at the feast there, and then, as a group, they start for home. And they got a day's journey, and suddenly they realized, we've lost God. How do you lose God? They lost Him. Now, the Bible just kind of quickly gives us the account, but can you imagine this? Imagine the conversation. Mary says, Joseph, where's Jesus? I don't know, Mary. Haven't seen Him. What do you mean you haven't seen Him? When's the last time you saw Him? Well, He was with you when we left Jerusalem. You haven't seen Him for a whole day? Joseph, He hasn't been with me. He's not with you. Where is He? Boy, they got frantic. They said, have you seen Jesus? Have you seen Jesus? Nobody had seen Him. And they recognized that He was back in Jerusalem. So, boy, they hurried back, didn't they? Where did they find Him? In the temple. And He's reasoning with the scholars. He's answering their questions. He's asking them questions. He's ministering to them as a 12-year-old boy, because He's God. And the Bible, it just gives us words. It doesn't supply emotion. So you come to that passage, and this is what you read. Mary comes to Jesus there in the temple, and she says this. These are the words. Son, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. Where hast thou been? Now those are the words. But I got a feeling there was a little more emotion to it than that, right? Be like losing your kid at Walmart. Son, where have you been? I've been looking everywhere. Good. Are you okay? Has anybody hurt you? I mean, there would be some consternation, right? And you remember what Jesus responded with? How is it that you sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? In other words, you should have known where to look. I'd be in the harvest place. When God seems absent, He's always in the harvest place. That girl I broke up with that day, we've been married 45 years now. But you see, at that moment, I wasn't ready for something as important as marriage. There was some purging in my life that had to take place. That 6 days in that hotel in La Puente, California, that door never opened. No one came in, no one went out. 6 days. No one came by to clean the room. No one came to ask if I needed anything. I had no money. I had nowhere to go. I didn't know a soul in L.A. I didn't eat a bite of food. And I've preached thousands of revivals since. But I'm going to tell you, that was the best meeting I've ever been in. Because it was just me and God in the humble place. See, when I came out of college, I'm ready to preach in the stadiums. Lord, where's the stadium? Fill it up. I've got 3 messages. I'm ready. God said, whoa. We got to go to the humble place first. And that morning behind my trailer in St. James, having my pity party back there behind the trailer, and all of a sudden a car pulled into the parking lot. Never forget, it was a 1954 Ford, an old antique car. And the driver was a man who in those parts was affectionately known as Tiny. He weighed over 400 pounds. Now, Tiny and his family did not attend that church in St. James. In fact, they lived 40 miles away. But they had come the night before to the Sunday night service. They had driven that 40 miles. And they had asked the pastor if they could talk to me after the service. We sat down in the front row with he and his wife and his 2 little girls. And Tiny began to weep. And he said, Brother Goetsch, we don't have a church in our town. We don't have a church that's preaching the Bible. We don't know what to do. We don't know if we should drive 80 miles with our little girls every time there's a service. Or whether we should try to start a church. We don't know anything about that. What do we do? Well, I didn't know much. But we sat there, my wife and I, and cried with him, and prayed with him, and tried to advise him as best we knew how. He pulled into that parking lot. He saw me behind the trailer, and he rolled down that window, and he said, Brother Goetsch, do you need any food? And I thought, now, who pulls into a church parking lot and asks a question like that? So I kind of pulled out of my pity party mode, and I walked over to the car, and I said, what are you talking about? He said, do you need any food? I said, well, sure. He said, get in the car. I got in. We started driving. We started driving to his house, 40 miles away. I said, Tiny, what is this all about? He said, I work for the Jolly Green Giant. I'm looking at him. He weighs over 400 pounds. I thought, are you the mascot? Or what, what do you do? I didn't know it at the time, but St. James is in a very fertile valley of Minnesota, and thousands, tens of thousands of acres of vegetables are grown there. And Del Monte and Jolly Green Giant had these huge processing plants, and Tiny was an executive with Jolly Green Giant. He said, Brother Goetsch, I walked out of my house this morning to go to work. He said, I have 4 freezers in my garage, and they're all full of food. He said, we throw stuff away at work, we mispackage it, we mislabel it, I bring it home, throw it in the freezer. I got 4 freezers full of food. He said, I walked out and I thought, I wonder if that preacher's hungry. Now I'm sitting there thinking, this is great. This is amazing. This is awesome. But seriously, Lord, green beans? I mean, I'm hungry, but broccoli? I mean, couldn't you speak to a beef farmer or somebody, you know? Boy, we got to his house. He flipped that garage door up, and there were those 4 freezers, and he pulled those lids up, and I didn't know it, but Jolly Green Giant made lasagna. They made Swiss steak. He started loading that old 54 Ford up with boxes of food. We got back to the church. We had to borrow the church freezer, the pastor's freezer, the neighbor's freezer. We were giving away food to get people to come to church by Friday night. And you know what God said to me? He said, you just keep ministering to people on the front row. I can feed you. Does God seem absent tonight? He's in the holy place. He's in the humble place. He's in the harvest place. He hasn't moved. We have. And if we draw nigh to Him, He'll draw nigh to us. In the humble place. In the holy place.